Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. My name is Pierce and I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and your host for today's conversation. The Transnational Series focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. One of the great joys of virtual events is collaborating with bookstores we deeply admire, and we are grateful to be presenting this event in partnership with our friends at Community Bookstore and Third Place Books. Community Bookstore, celebrating over 50 years in Park Slope, is Brooklyn's oldest operating bookstore. And founded in 1998, Third Place Books serves the Pacific Northwest with 3 stores across the Seattle metro area in Lake Forest Park, Ravenna, and Seward Park. As we continue on today's conversation, I just want to offer a quick Zoom webinar tutorial. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a few icons. One of those is a Q&A icon where you can enter in your questions at any time during the conversation. Another button will get you to the chat window. That space is there for you all. Please feel free to chat during the event. I will be in the chat as well, dropping in useful information, including links to books by our authors. We do make every effort to keep these events free to attend in the hopes you will purchase the featured books from us. So thank you in advance for taking a look and supporting independent bookstores. And finally, you can see us, but we can't see you, so relax and please enjoy the conversation. Today I have the very great honor of introducing Brenda Lozano, Heather Cleary, and Catherine Lacey, here to discuss and celebrate the release of Witches. Brenda Lozano is a fiction writer, essayist, and editor. Her books include Todo Nada, All or Nothing, followed by Loop, and a book of short stories, Como Piensan las Piedras, How Stones Think. In 2015, she was selected by Canaculta, the Hay Festival, and the British Council as one of Mexico's best fiction writers under 40. In 2017, she was added to the Bogota 39 list, a selection of the best fiction writers under 40 from across Latin America. Witches is her most recent novel. Heather Cleary has translated poetry and prose by writers including Bettina Gonzalez, Sergio Shefek, and Maria Ospina. Her work has been recognized by the National Book Foundation, the Best Translated Book Award, and the National Translation Award, among many others. And today's moderator, Catherine Lacey, is the author of 4 books, most recently Pew. I'm so thrilled to have them here together in conversation, and now Brenda, Heather, and Catherine.
Hi again.
Hi.
I'm so excited to be here and be talking to you about this book. This was the first book I read this year. It was like literally January 1st, and I loved it. I just delighted in it. It was so exciting to see how you had moved and changed as a writer, and I'm so thrilled to be here and to be talking to Heather as well. Yeah, I meant to mention, Heather, feel free to interrupt me because we both probably have questions to ask Brenda, and I'm certainly not the only person that could be asking questions. But maybe you still have unresolved questions about the book itself from the translation point of view. But yeah, are we gonna start with a reading? Was that how it was gonna go? I think.
Sure. That sounds great. Can you hear me okay? Is my connection okay?
Yeah, perfect. All good.
Okay. Fantastic. So I was looking through the novel again, thinking about what I might read today, and I realized that probably the best thing to do is just begin at the beginning, because Brenda does such an amazing job of setting up the characters and setting up some of the central themes of the book in the first 2 chapters. So for those of you who don't know, and thank you all so much for joining us today. For those of you who don't know, it's a novel written in 2 voices. So the chapters alternate between the character of Feliciana, who is the curandera, and Zoe, who is a young journalist from Mexico City. So I'll read just a brief chapter from each of those 2 voices, and I think that will get us in a place where we can start talking about the novel and what Brenda does here. Okay. So the first chapter is in the voice of Feliciana. It was 6 at night when Guadalupe came to tell me they had killed Paloma. I don't remember times or dates. I don't know when I was born because I was born like the mountain was. Go ask the mountain when it was born. But I know it was 6 p.m. when Guadalupe came to say they killed Paloma as she was getting ready to go out. I saw her there in her room. I saw her body on the floor and the shine for her eyes on her fingers. And I saw her hands. There were two in the mirror. And the shine was on both, like she had just put it on her eyes, like she could get up to put some on mine. Paloma loved many men who didn't love her back, and she loved many men who did. They came one after another to her vigil, and her vigil was like a vela. My sister Francisca and I had Paloma from my father's side. She was all we had from his family. She was the daughter of my father's brother Gaspar, who is also dead. Paloma was the only one who carried the curandero blood of my father and my grandfather and of my great-grandfather, the curandero. She was the one who taught me what I know. She was the one who told me, Feliciana, you're a curandera because you carry it in your blood. She told me, this is how you do this thing or the other thing, and that's not how you do that. And she told me, you have the language, love. She was the one who said, Feliciana, you are the curandera of the language because yours is the book. Paloma healed many men who didn't love her and many men who did. She healed many people and told others their future, and told them the future of affections in bloom or of affections that had wilted and turned to hate. And people liked her for that because she was good at giving advice about love. People laughed with her and they went to her because she was good at giving advice about love. Death called to Paloma 3 times. The first time it called to her was when she fell in love with a politician. Death laid its egg in her then. It called to her a second time when she loved a loveless man, and that time death trilled its song in her ear. The third time death called to her was when she loved a man from the city who had a disease still unborn but soon to be, and death sang to her as clear as the sun that it would come to her at 6 the night Guadalupe came to me to say they killed her with the shine on her fingers, and I saw her in the mirror 2 times, and 2 times she looked so alive except for the stain of blood spreading under her. A terrible hour. I remember that terrible hour. For me, it was 6 at night everywhere in the world, 6 at night today and yesterday and tomorrow and for all time, even though each place has its own clock, its own time and its own tongue. For me, the only time and tongue and the only words were those because Guadalupe had come to say they killed Paloma. It was 6 at night and shadows fell across the milpa. It was exactly 6 at night when the language left me. So that's the whole first chapter. That explains a little bit sort of the origin of this encounter between Feliciana and Zoe. And I'll read just part of the Zoe chapter. I agreed to write the article about Paloma's murder because gender-based violence sends me into a rage. I couldn't take the unending stream of news stories about femicide, rape, and abuse anymore, or the sexist jokes I'd hear around the office for that matter. Any situation or remark that targeted a woman or someone who identified as one would set me off, and I wanted to do whatever I could from the trench I dug at the newsroom. Plus, I wanted to meet Feliciana. I was fascinated by her. When I took the assignment, I didn't know any more about her than anyone else did. I knew she was the legendary curandera of the language and the most famous shaman alive. I know that the words she used in her veladas, the ceremonies she performed, had miraculous healing powers. And I knew the stories about artists, writers, directors, and musicians who traveled halfway around the world to meet her. The professors and linguists from other countries who'd gone to see her in the mountains of San Felipe. I knew that books, films, songs, and paintings had come out of these visits. I didn't know exactly which ones, but I knew they existed. I received a photo of Paloma lying on the ground in a pool of blood next to a bed draped with a peacock fro. A coworker wrote me a 2-line email saying that Paloma was related to Feliciana and had initiated her as a curandera, but that was all the information he had. I've never been into supernatural stuff, definitely not fortune tellers or whatever. Making money off a person's faith always felt like a scam to me. I've never had my tarot read or looked at my horoscope in a magazine. Someone once explained to me what a birth chart was. I couldn't focus on what they were saying. I just kept wondering how they could have gotten so interested in astrology. Someone else once asked me what sign my 2-year-old was. I had no idea, so they looked it up right there on their phone, and that was how I learned that Felix is a Libra. One time, when Leander and I were kids, a drunk with a gravelly voice read our palms in the park. The only thing I remember is the alcohol and the breath of this so-called psychic, who wore enormous square sunglasses and spat when he talked. I've always been a skeptic, but there were a few moments with my mother and sister that made me wonder about the power of intuition, where it came from, how to explain it. I wanted to learn more about this famous curandera of the language, and I wanted to cast as much light as possible on what had happened to Paloma, to find out who she was. I'd like to say that Paloma's murder led me to Feliciana. At least that's how the interview began. But this isn't the story of a crime. I'll admit that I thought I was going to make a difference with my article, that I was going to help someone, but I was the one who found help through my conversation with Feliciana. I had no idea how badly I needed it. All this, everything that's written here, is what I came to understand because of her. This is the story of who Feliciana is and of who Paloma was. I had wanted to get to know them, but I realized right away the people that I needed to get to know better were my sister Leandra and my mother, myself. I came to understand that you can't really know another woman until you know yourself. I'll leave it there so that we can start talking about this beautiful novel that you wrote, Bren.
It's a good line to end on, and also I feel like it was kind of a buried concern of the book in some ways is women trying to understand themselves through other women's stories, and sort of finding the through line between, like, you know, no matter where you're growing up, no matter what like your particular situation or struggles are, there's just these kind of recurrent issues that all women share, and finding those sort of through lines seems like a concern of the book. But I think just also the immediate thing that jumps out to me is just the duality of these two voices. They're so different, just syntactically and like rhythm wise, and personality. Just even like hearing Heather read it out loud, you can hear how like the breath moves differently in each of these characters too. And so to me it seems extremely challenging, one, to like write with two different voices in mind at all time. It feels like I guess well, can we start there? I'm just sort of curious about how, Brenda, like what was the experience of living with these two characters, talking to each other, talking to you, talking through you?
Well, first of all, I have to say I'm super happy and super excited because, first of all, you're both friends that I really love, both of you. So that's the most important thing for me. So I have to say that. Of course, you're both very talented, and I'm also very honored. And yeah, it's a gift for me that we're friends. But also, I admire your work very much, both of you. So yes, I'm super, super, super happy. So, well, back to the question. Well, yes, I was, well, you know, Mexico is very violent. It's a very violent country, especially against women. 11 women are killed daily in this country just because, you know, the fact they're women. So from feminism, I had many, many questions that I wanted to approach from fiction. So yeah, well, I was also questioning, well, I had many questions, and this is of course a very modest way to answer those questions. But basically, yes, I had I was intrigued of how language flows and how language works, and yeah, mostly flows, not work. Work is a very Marxist word right now, but yeah, how language, yeah, it has its own nature, no? How does it flow in a more rural space and a more urban space? And of course, through all these violences, and because women bodies are also territories, how these violences go through these bodies and in these other different spaces. So, well, perhaps it sounded a little bit complicated, or me translating this to English sounds perhaps a bit complicated or something. But well, the thing was that, of course, in a city, and capitalism and patriarchy and all this, you know, problems that intertwine, no? Of course, patriarchy, capitalism, racism, classism, and all these things. Of course, they build the idea of language, and they build sentences, and they build also violences. And so how we speak in Spanish or in English they're both hegemonic languages, how we build sentences and from those spaces have a very different pace. And yeah, almost like verbs have to do a lot with capitalism, right? Because they're action and they make things work and go from one sentence to another. And that's being productive, right? Like you have to say this, full stop, like short sentences, things work. And many of the words that we choose from there have to do a lot with products, of course. No, we use Kleenex. No, we don't use a tissue, or I don't know. There are many words that have to do with brands. No, and all those implications in language. But I found it was very interesting to think that in Mexico, there are a huge amount of tongues or languages from indigenous communities. So that's the opposite, right? From an hegemonic and a capitalistic, and I mean, it's quite the opposite. So I was wondering how these two, let's call living entities that are words from these two very different spaces could, yeah, dialogue, communicate, and also intertwine. How can that be? So how is a metaphor, for example, from that other perspective? And what if if your references are not out from supermarkets or from TV, for example, or memes or those things that we live with, but I don't know, Starry Night or I don't know, the a milpa or I don't know, what do you play when you're 5 years old and you live in a small town in Mexico, for example? No, so what are your metaphors? How do you relate to language? So I found that super interesting, and I wanted, of course, also to question, well, of course, two female characters, and from those two very different spaces and their relation with language from this very two different contexts, but also like the idea of power. I was questioning myself, like, what is power? And of course, it has to do a lot with money and, you know, how the world somehow works today. And that's also a question from feminism, no? Like, what is power? And does that also imply a powerless relation? Or so what is power? And I came to the idea of, well, I came to this character, Maria Sabina, that it was, sorry if I'm taking too long. Please interrupt.
No, please go on. And you just got to you came to this character. I'm on the edge of my seat.
Okay, so I came to this character that's amazing, who's called Maria Sabina, who was a curandera or a healer or a bruja from the 50s till the 80s when she died. So basically she worked, well, she was Mazatec in Oaxaca, and she healed with mushrooms, and yeah, basically with mushrooms. But of course, well, I actually came to her because she had a relation with, you know, one of the founders of the bank, JP Morgan Chase.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Was that the banker that did the time profile?
Yeah, so there's so a famous banker in the 50s was ay, amiga, ayúdame, ¿cómo se dice? Como le interesaban mucho los hongos, tenía una afiliación, sorry for that. I'm trying to find that word.
He was really interested in hallucinogenic mushrooms.
Yeah. With his wife. So they were both obsessed on, you know, knowing more about this. And they came to this small article in Time magazine written by a linguist, sí, se dice así, ¿no? Una lingüista, by a linguist based in La Sierra Mazateca, in I forget the name right now of the town. It will come to me. But well, she lived there, and she know the fame that Maria Sabina in the 50s, like imagine a town in Mexico in the 50s. It's like going back to the 10th or the 15th century. Like it was, you know, and they only spoke Mazatec, of course, but this woman, this American woman, worked there with these people and wrote this small article about this like fantastic woman that did this mushroom ceremonies. And this guy in New York, no, she was not a writer. She didn't know how to write or read. She only spoke Mazatec. And it was this very short woman that, like Borges, was like a splendid old woman always, no? Like, so, well, this like imagine also New York in the 50s, the American dream, like this super powerful guy, white guy, of course, reads this article of this woman in the Sierra Mazateca. And well, he goes with his wife to La Sierra Mazateca, and they have a mushroom ceremony, and he's like amazed by what happens there. So he also writes a longer article on Maria Sabina and what she does and everything. So that's sort of the like the spark that starts the fire, and there's somehow like a boom, like also at the end of the 50s, when you know, when all the pop and rock and roll scene starts bursting or starts like happening, and of course with it, with all the music and cinema and everything, all the experiments with marijuana and mushrooms and the things. So it is said that the Beatles came to Mexico to see Maria Sabina, and it is said that Aldous Huxley wrote The Doors of Perception after a mushroom journey with Maria Sabina. So she's a lot in pop culture, I would say, you know, and that Disney came to Mexico and did Fantasia, that movie, that super trippy movie that we all saw when we were kids. So it happened after a mushroom ceremony with Maria Sabina. So I thought like, wow, this woman, who is she? Like, what would happen if someone like that lived today, you know, in Instagram days and Twitter, and of course with a more how can I say this, like where capitalism in a world where capitalism is of course I wouldn't say I wouldn't like to say in bloom, because it's a terrible word for capitalism, but sorry, I'm running out of, I have only few words in English. So, well, when capitalism is, of course, so dominant in this world, what happens if power comes from words and from someone who's not making money of this? And what happens if she's a woman? And what happens if she's an indigenous woman that doesn't even care about talking or writing or speaking in English or any hegemonic language? And what happens if she purely like has this true and deep power with words, and that she actually can heal and see things through language? So for me, if Marvel or, you know, like one of these like studios gave me like, what would you do, like a character, a super like a superhero, no? I would say, look, of course, someone like that, like someone who has the power of words. That's my fantasy. I'm a writer, as my friends here with me are too, and that's like the fantasy, you know, like you can change a narrative, you can change politics, you can change society, you can even change like a terrible moment in your life just by the way you tell yourself the story, or you use words, no? So yeah. I was exploring that. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. I love this thing, or I was really struck by this observation that you said, that like women are like territories, and that these two narrators are from very different like physical places, and so you're kind of seeing the places that they are a product of, reflected in their voices and reflected in their kind of like their sense of being. Did you have to did you need to be in different places to write these two people? And then I also realized when we first met at Oh My, were you working on Brujas?
No.
Okay.
I was struggling. Actually, you know what? Because my dear friend Catherine and I met at this residency upstate New York. It was fantastic.
Because I write differently up there than I can write in the city. Becomes a totally different thing. And I was thinking of the way that you're isolated, you're just kind of on the like, oh, and Rachel's here too. Rachel Cantor, she was also there that same residency, right? That same week, month,
yeah,
whatever.
Yeah, hey Rachel.
Yes. Okay. But no, I definitely like write differently if I'm in an environment where I'm like, bare feet in the grass kind of thing. And it's like it, and I don't know, I just like wonder for you, if were there different places that you wrote these two different characters, or did you necessarily have to toggle in between the two of them because it was about the relationship between the two of them? Or was the project more like, okay, no, build this character up and spend some time with her and then spend some other time with the other?
It's funny that you asked this, right? Well, because actually I was struggling doing another novel that didn't work out, and yeah, I was very frustrated, but I was trying to work on this novel where somehow the voice of Feliciana was there. So I was not directly, I was indirectly working on that book, struggling with another book that didn't, it is a very frustrating thing for me, because I really wanted to make it work. But Feliciana was somehow there, but not directly. But yeah, it is funny, right? Because fiction, I don't know, it's interesting. I was writing the Feliciana part from Mexico City mostly, and it is complicated. Like, how do you write a voice of a female that's, of course, super famous, but she doesn't really care a fuck if she's famous or not, and she's not doing it from there. But this woman that works with language, that has a power with language, that can change narratives, and that's also a healer through language. But how do you write that? Like, being 30 something and you live in a city and you speak an hegemonic language, and how do you do things from there? So it was amazing. Like, it was truly, truly amazing, because that's what fiction gives, that freedom to imagine and to think, how could that be? How can she speak? So one of the questions I had before embarking this book was, well, I cannot appropriate, like, let's say, a Mazatec. Like, if I explored how an indigenous language works, or its own metaphors or references, that would be somehow appropriation. And I didn't want to do that, of course, with all respect. But fiction lets you imagine things and, make a character. So I didn't want it to go back to the 50s or the 70s with Maria Sabina, but what if this character lives today, and how would she be? That was my question. Like, it was more like an archaeological job. Like, well, I have this image of her childhood, no? Of her playing, of Feliciana playing with her sister. How do they play in a small town in Mexico today, no? Or, well, a few years ago. So, well, they have fun, just putting some hay on top of a dog's back, and they laugh. just seeing how the hay falls when the dog starts running faster or whatever. Like, so I had like something small, and you have to dig a little bit deeper to see, so what else happened in that childhood, and how do they have fun, all the things that happen. Like, just start digging. No, sorry, I think I lost.
No, it's sweet. It's sweet thinking about, like, I also wondered if, like, if Garcia, the healer who was like so popular in the 50s or anything, if there was something about her that you kind of split in between Paloma and Feliciana too, because it didn't seem like there was not. She seemed like the influence of that real life character seemed to be in kind of more than one place.
Well, I mean,
and also, well, just to go back, also, it seems like the voice of Feliciana was the first voice that came out of these two, between Zoe and Feliciana.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you absolutely know how these things work. Yeah. So
but then Zoe came in to almost like argue with it, or like you're sort of arguing with yourself on the page with her. She seems very, in some ways, similar to you, because she's coming from Mexico City and she's a journalist and all these things that you share with her. But I also know, like, maybe she's a more extreme, like, she's very far from you in some ways and far from these characters in order to sort of like cast a different light on them.
Yes, we're always far from the characters, but also at the same time we're all the characters, no? It's funny how that how you reflect yourself in those characters. And yeah, it happens. It's amazing. You can write about a 70-year-old woman who lives in a sierra in Mexico, and you can like make up all her background and her life and her past. But at the same time, your life, I mean, I grew up watching The Simpsons on TV, right? So I don't know, it's
our voices are kind of getting like blended down into some sort of like mono voice a little bit. I wanted to also bring in Heather to ask about, well, I guess I'm curious a little bit about the kind of like, how did you find Brenda's work originally, and like what led you to be the translator on Witches?
Well, actually, I just wanted to circle back a little bit, because there's a sort of nuts and bolts aspect to the translation with these two voices that, I mean, Brenda, you mentioned a little bit like how you constructed these two spaces, but the translation process is different because it's not exactly coming up with the voices, but Brenda does such a beautiful job of sort of weaving details back. I mean, the text is very much also like a textile in many ways. Like, there are threads that kind of got brought forward and then back. And so I did, when I translated the novel, I went through chapter by chapter. I went through in a linear way so that I could see what information was being revealed when, and when the circling back was happening, and how the two voices were sort of in this almost, I mean, it's a dialogue, but it's an elliptical dialogue. Sometimes Feliciana responds directly to something that Zoe has said in the previous chapter, and sometimes it doesn't work that way. So in the translation, I first went through chapter by chapter, but then I actually broke the two voices down and I separated them. And in the editing process, I only did one voice at a time. And then I put it all back together. So I don't know if that was how you worked, but I found for the translation process. With regard to how we met, we've known each other for maybe 15 years now. Is that possible? We met many years ago when Bren was doing the MFA at NYU, and we had some people in common, and we just and we've collaborated on several texts over the years, usually shorter pieces. But then with this novel, I don't know, we had the great good fortune of being able to work together on this longer project together, and I couldn't be happier about it.
Oh, that's so cool. I'm also like, I'm not surprised that you had to kind of like have the voices be separate to some degree. And also like, I love this idea of like, of Brenda's work, of this book in particular, but I think of Brenda's work in general as being like a textile. And I mean, especially it's more overt in Loop. I mean, it's like a kind of fundamental part of the way that whole book is structured, but it was interesting to see it like come back here again too. I know I had some other question. Oh, I guess going back to like, something that we talked about briefly earlier. So like writing about a place that has already been written about so much, or people already have a kind of preconceived like visual or kind of feeling image about, that's often like, you know, kind of overgrown with sort of vines of cliche and stuff like this. And I mean, I relate to this problem when or if I ever like write about the American South, I'm kind of like, we're up against all these all these horrible, stupid movies and like just kind of the dumbest versions of stuff. And so I wonder about like, you know, writing about like rural Mexico or even Mexico City or any of these kind of like indigenous or sort of like ancient healing modalities or whatever, like all the things that you're sort of up against when it comes to like not getting kind of mired down in like the cliched version of saying something, or the associations that a reader is going to bring, whether you want them to or not. I was wondering like what your strategies, and I have my theories about what your strategies were now because I've read the book and everything, but like what were your strategies for making the place real without it dipping into kind of like a, you know, these preconceived caricatures that we have even in our brains, you know, of like the places I got, like you have to edit out or like purge in some way.
Yeah, all the Mexico Mágico, my dear. Yeah. Well, it is a very good question actually, and I would love to also hear what are your strategy. Sorry. How do you do? How do you avoid this like commonplaces? No.
You're asking me. I just asked you that question. It's your book launch. You have to answer.
Cheating.
It is a very good question. Well, it's a huge question actually. Like, because it has to. It comes down when you start like picturing everything, and how do you. Sorry, many questions, many asking myself many questions would be the shortest answer. Like, how do you do this without
My theory is that for you in particular, that like voice is a way in, you know, like I feel like everything I've read from you has been so voice driven, even when like in this there is, you know, a plot and a murder and a lot of like historical references in different places, and there's a lot more going on, a wider cast of characters than like say for Loop, for instance, is primarily taking place within the mind of the main narrator, or the only narrator and the main character. But still I felt like the main sort of animating sort of central kind of pillar of the novel were these two voices, or just voice in general,
I think it also has to do a lot with the first person, right? Because a third person gives you more space, let's say, to tell a story from a more more like a movie, you know, like this is happening in this space, and you get space also for more commonplaces or for more cliches, right? Because someone is describing more objectively the space. First person has different problems, I would say, in describing. And how do you many times you don't need to describe many things from the first person or spaces, or I think it's also it also has a lot to do with the choice you make when you choose the focus, or first person or third person. I think the third person has can easier go to those cliches in a way, no? But first person, from a political point of view, I think first person in literature, especially for us women writing and as women writers, is a very important take, right? Because we all study literature and well here and yeah, as writers we've grown up reading basically male writers, right? And it is only in the last years that we've been reading more women, and like, you know, all those blind spots that we had, like rereading history, like with this new readings. Sorry, I think we're running out of time, but well, yeah, like very shortly, I would say that the first person, especially from being a female writer and working with a female point of view, it's important, like in also telling stories from that point of view. I think it's also important to think that.
Yeah, I was looking back over like how was sort of Luke talked about in the States or in like English speaking world, and it was sort of put in this lineage of a lot of like American and English writers that do this like fragmentary, like, you know, basically female writers that write in a kind of like fragmentary, like recursive space. And I felt a little bit like there was something actually, I think about your work in particular, there's something like much more inventive and playful than even like that, like yes, you're doing that, but there's like 5 other things that you're doing on top of it. And I think like we don't have enough references. We don't have enough writers to compare people to at this point. I think partially because like a lot of like female writers that are living right now are like breaking down a lot of the like norms that we're actually used to. We're not actually able to see the ways in which they are like different or similar to like male writers. I think like female writers often just get compared to other female writers because we kind of can't see past some of the like the surface level stuff where it's like, oh, this person's writing about being a mother, and so only women can write about being a mother, and so like we can only compare this book to other women that have written about being a mother, when actually maybe if you look like through the lines, I mean, I'm not talking about you in particular, I'm making up an abstract person, but like if you look through the lines, there's actually like, you know, it's a comment upon society in the same way that like Dickens wrote about society, you know. And it's like if we can't see past the kind of like surface level thing, we don't even know who to compare these writers to. And I think we're very much in the middle of that process in terms of like, you know, contemporary female writers carving out new spaces and finding like new ways to approach story. And just in the same way that like in between languages, and this is what I love, I really like gravitate towards like reading work in translation, not because it's so inherently different from work that hasn't been translated, but there are these little moments of like, you see that like, oh, this word couldn't be translated because like these two languages are sort of having to push up against each other and find what they have in common and what they have, where the differences are, you know. And there's something about that right now, like with like female writers sort of retranslating the world for male readers in a certain way, or just like into literature in general, not really for male readers, but like, I don't know, I'm interested in that question right now too.
It's super interesting, and I am actually very interested also in hearing what Heather has to say about this retranslating and translating. And yeah, what do you think about this?
I mean, I think the way Catherine expressed it was, I don't know that I could, no lo podría superar. So I'm not going to. I think you said it perfectly. The idea that that it happens very often that readers and the market as a whole kind of tries to siphon works into categories that already exist, rather than allowing for their specificity and allowing for sort of the productive friction that happens when a form is being used that isn't entirely familiar. or ways of, I mean, metaphors, anything, right? And I think this is something that we see a lot in both in the process of bringing works into English and the kind of the market side of translated literature and what books get translated and how they're marketed and how they're discussed in the press and all of this, and also in the richness that can bring once they're actually through and in dialogue with other traditions. And
we have a question in the chat that is, what do you think that men can do to amplify female voices? Because obviously there are blind spots and suppressed perspectives owing to the predominant male voices out there. Like this is like, it's like always a good question, right? Like what can like white people do to amplify voices of people of color? What can we do across these lines? You know, straight and queer and everything. Does anybody have any suggestions?
You, Heather, Catherine?
It's a perennial question because it's a difficult one to actually like come to any conclusive stance about. I'm not, yeah, I don't know. I guess, I mean, it's like funny. I feel like this is like, we were like talking about like even just this language a few years back, and yet it already feels like it's sort of like dipped into cultural amnesia of like, are we still doing that? Are people still like giving a shit about that? Like it almost feels like a question from the past somehow that I'm not sure ever got resolved, or probably is not going to be resolved. But I don't know. I mean, I guess like there's like a point at which you kind of have to scrutinize like what you've read and what you've been reading, and I think going back to Heather's like point about like the market, especially with books, like the market sort of wants everything to be fitting into like a pre-existing category. And I think like we get sort of inflicted by that viewing books and viewing culture in that way too, where like we kind of are like, well, I like this thing and I don't like that thing, and so I want to read more things like this and less things like that. And it's kind of constantly questioning, well, why? Like how am I like relating or not relating to this you know, subject matter or like perspective or style or whatever. I don't know, just like kind of maybe just constantly being an inquiry with yourself first. I mean, like the line that Heather ended the reading on of like that a woman has to know herself in order to know other women. I think that applies to human beings just in general. Like we have to kind of look inward and sort of see what our like what are our blind spots personally to kind of understand how we occupy space within like a community or within like a lineage.
Yeah, I love what you say also about reading and, well, what we write and what we read and reread today. Like how do we read, for example, the classics, no? Or the tradition, if I can say that, like going back to the Greeks, for example. I'm going back to the tragedy, to the three tragic writers. And how do you go back and how do you retell the story and how do you see it from this other perspective, no? Where of course some things may I don't know, some things are somehow complicated, yeah, or directly like a bit misogynist, or the idea of a female character, no, in a Shakespeare play, for example, or how does Chekhov write about the female roles also, or I don't know, I really love these writers, of course, but how do you reread them, no? How do we tell these stories today and from this perspective, where of course back then it was totally different, like how they were received. I don't know, just yeah.
Do you are there any like classics that you're like rereading now, or like what is your relation? Because I mean, I think in Loop you also like there's a lot about that character's sort of reading habits and sort of all the different voices that are going into the way that she's seeing the world, and these writers sort of becoming characters in her life, or actually like literally becoming characters in the book at times. But like what, I mean, you're a very different writer now than you are when you wrote Loop, of course. And I definitely like see that like kind of growth and expansion in this book, but what has your relationship to like classic literature, anything changed recently?
I love going back to the classics. I really enjoy, and it's very compelling to go back to the Greeks, for example. I really like going back to the three, a los tres trágicos griegos, like Euripides, Sophocles, Aeschylus. I think that all stories were told by those three, three guys, very cool guys. I totally recommend them. They have future.
Very cool guys out there. Back in ancient Greece. I love this idea of the cool guys of ancient Greece.
Yeah, well, actually, yes. Euripides, the last one and the most modern of the three Greeks. Basically, all his characters are women, and it's very interesting to think that nowadays, like how these tragedies happen. For example, Medea, no? Like they somehow break the patriarchal like what's expected of a woman, no? Mm-hmm. They break this, like the tragedy happens when these women break this dictum, this patriarchy dictum, no, somehow. I don't know, perhaps it's too intense, but I would like to have this conversation with a beer and yeah, but I really like going back to the Greeks. And actually yesterday I was reading, because I'm trying to work something, how mysterious, right? I'm trying to work something. Well, I'm trying to work something, and I'm trying to see some things and how do they work in plays. And I was reading yesterday, I was comfortably reading Shakespeare, Sueño de una noche de verano. I was reading it in Spanish. ¿Cómo se llama, amiga?
Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah, but I was reading it in Spanish. And yeah, it has this fantastic, like, the play inside the play. And that's exactly what I'm trying to reread now and to work something on how that happens. And well, I got this call from a friend and I ended up going to a party, but gladly I I finished the play before I went to the party. But yeah, so I always love to reread and to go back. The classics. That play we did that play in high school, so it was very funny to reread it now.
I love that your reading of it got interrupted by being invited to a party. It's very Midsummer Night's Dream. There's a really good question here that
sorry. I have to tell you this. We didn't go to that Japanese, my dear Catherine, but this time that you come, we're going there.
Okay.
Together. I was at the Japanese restaurant where we normally go, and I started reading there the Shakespeare play the other day, and it was amazing because it's all about a marriage, right? And they are thinking that the characters are thinking about representing a play of also somehow like the Romeo and Juliet from the Greeks. That's Pyramantis. Well, anyway, it's a play about marriage, no, basically, and love and all this. And next to me, there were two friends talking about they were planning the marriage of one of them. So it was amazing. I was reading the play. It was happening, Shakespeare also. Yeah. This guy is also everywhere. It was actually next to me, and they were talking things very similar to the things that were the characters were questioning about marriage and love and everything. So just Shakespeare
it literally sounds like a scene that you wrote. Like, I think if you just wrote it down, I would be like, oh, Brenda made this all up. It's very on brand.
No, it happened. I mean, Shakespeare's also everywhere. Everywhere. Like, you go to a Japanese restaurant in Mexico City where there's two other women. I have to say one of them was English and the other one was American. And they were both talking about the same thing that I was reading, you know, Shakespeare's everywhere.
Yeah.
I recommend that guy also.
There's one last question I want to slip in for Heather from the Q&A section. It's Heather, can you talk about what linguistic choices you made in the text that carry political implications? How did you approach these moments when you're sitting down to start translating? Thank you for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you something like that too, so that was well put.
Yeah, it's a great question. I have an obnoxious answer, which is that almost every choice in any translation, not only this one, is political in a way. But I think particularly with this text, the first answer that comes to mind is deciding which words to leave in Spanish. Because precisely actually because of what Catherine was saying before about the ways in which it creates, it draws attention to those frictions between the cultural sensibilities that are built around linguistic structures, right? And so the way that we name something creates or reflects, or some combination of the two, the way in which we interact with that idea, with that object. And so there are certain terms from something as simple as pulque, which is an alcohol, it's a fermented beverage, which I chose not to explain or translate in the text, to something more complex around leaving the term curandera or curandero because of the importance of the gendered modifier at the end of the word. So all of those choices were political in their way. Then there's also the layer of, choosing to anchor the translation in the archival footage of Maria Sabina, to try to create sort of a specific reference rather than an imagined other. That was important in my process, at least. I hope that answers your question. I know we don't have a lot of time left.
Yeah, I think it was a good start. It's a huge question, and I think it's like, certainly it's like a, somebody who like it admires and sort of is like baffled by the complexity of translation. Like it's in every single choice that you're making, of course, and it's sort of like, yeah, just trying to describe like step by step how you walk. It's like, well, it's there's a lot of different, many little tiny muscles moving in there, and you can kind of, yeah, get lost.
Can I say something?
Yeah. Please, yes.
Heather's work is beautiful. She's the smartest, and I'm really honored that we did this together. She's really, really, really talented, and I'm also lucky because she's also my friend. No, basically, she's first of all my friend, and then I'm lucky because we did this book together.
Thank you. I'm lucky too. It was such a beautiful process. I know there's so many more things that we could talk about, like the editing and all of that we did back and forth, and it was a beautiful process over a couple of months.
Well, I think everybody here, if you don't already have a copy of the book, definitely get it from your local independent bookseller that's supporting this event. And yeah, there's so much in it. I can't say enough good about it. It's like, I'm literally out of words. It's just one of my favorite books of the year, and a real thrill to be here talking to the two of you. So
thank you.
Thank you
also, yeah.
Thank you all. This has been incredible, a really amazing conversation. Thank you to everyone watching. I'm just seeing the chat as people are coming in with all of their thanks and lovely compliments. Three of you have just been so special together. It's really an honor and a gift to hear you talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Piers.
Absolutely, everyone. And with that, I will say goodbye. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for hosting us.
Thank
Thank
you.
Beautiful book one last time.
Oh yeah.
Let's do
It
the
was
hold up. There
amazing
we
with
go.
your hair. Ah, wait, I have my.
Ah,
No.
I want a picture of this. Oh Jesus.
Anyway, thank you everyone. Goodbye.